Good day to all of you. I hope all is well. And I am looking forward that this video would help you facilitate in your study of Book 2 of the Revised Penal Code. To start with, we have Crimes Against National Security and the Law of Nations under Title 1 of your book. Article 114, you have the treason. The law says that any Filipino citizen who leaves war against the Philippines and adheres to her enemies, giving them aid or comfort within the Philippines or elsewhere, shall be punished by reclusion perpetua to death and shall pay a fine not to exceed 4 million pesos. If you notice here in Article 114, you can see herein, under this first paragraph, that a Filipino citizen can be made liable for treason wherever he may be. He may be inside within our country or anywhere else. For as long as you are a Filipino citizen, you may be made liable for treason. So that would answer the first question, who can be made liable for treason? Now you might be asking, when shall a Filipino citizen be made liable for treason? Under the same paragraph, you can see therein that a Filipino citizen is liable or may be liable for treason either. First, you have there levies war against the Philippines. Second, adheres to her enemies, giving them aid or comfort. In other words, there are two ways of committing treason. The next paragraph would show you that no person shall be convicted of treason unless by the testimony of two witnesses at least to the same overt act or on confession of the accused in open court. The second paragraph shows you that there are actually two ways of proving treason. To reiterate, the first paragraph shows you two ways of committing treason. The next paragraph shows you two ways of proving treason. You have their testimony of two witnesses. That is also known as the two witness rule. Take note that this two witness rule is applicable as far as testimony to prove overt act of the accused. The law says same overt act. And the next one is confession of the accused in open court. What do we mean by this? That is the confession of the accused before the court who has jurisdiction over the case. Now take note that confession of the accused even done spontaneously when he was arrested, let's say when he was in the jail or anywhere, and somebody or he told it, he confesses his guilt to somebody else, that is not the confession referred to in Article 114. This must be done, the confession referred to here is done in open court. So when will this happen? When the accused will be arraigned and the information against him will be read and he will just plead guilty. So that is the confession of the accused in open court referred to in Article 114. Now you might be asking, is it only Filipino citizens that can be made liable for treason? The answer is in the negative. An alien, meaning to say a foreigner, could also be made liable for treason for as long as, at the time of the commission of the offense, the alien is a resident here in the Philippines. If he is outside the country, he cannot be made liable for treason. Now, what are his acts of treason? The same as that of the Filipino citizen, levying war against the government or adhere to her enemies, giving them aid or comfort. In other words, who are or what are the elements of treason? That the offender is a Filipino citizen or an alien residing in the Philippines, that there is war in which the Philippines is involved, Now, we are done actually with the first element, and that is very clear. Filipino citizen, alien residing in the Philippines. How about the second element? The law provides that there is a war in which the Philippines is involved. In other words, treason can only be committed in times of war. If the Philippines is not involved in any war, treason cannot be committed. Now, take note of the last element that the offender either levies war against the government or adheres to her enemies, giving them aid or comfort. Now, all the elements must be present to make one liable for treason. Absent any one of the elements, that would result to the acquittal of the accused. He cannot be made guilty, criminally guilty of the crime of treason. So this is just a repetition of what we have discussed earlier. You have there Filipino citizen, an alien resident that can be made liable for treason. In other words, what then is treason? Treason is a breach of allegiance to a government committed by a person who owes allegiance to it. And allegiance is meant the obligation of fidelity and obedience which the individual owe to the government under which they live or to their sovereign in return for the protection they receive. Now you might be asking, what if the Filipino citizen is outside the country? Now take note, since you are a Filipino citizen, wherever you go, you owe permanent allegiance to your country. Now, how about an alien? You might be saying that he owes allegiance to his country of origin. But if he is in the Philippines, he owes temporary allegiance to our country while being here in the Philippines because presumably he is receiving protection from our country while here in the Philippines. In other words, treason can be committed by one who breached his allegiance to the government, and that allegiance could either be permanent or temporary. Again, Filipinos owe permanent allegiance to the government. Resident aliens owes temporary allegiance to the Philippines. Ways of committing, two ways. Levying war against the government. And when we say levying war against the government, the law requires that there must be actual assembly of men for the purpose of executing a treasonable design by force. In other words, if the act of the accused is merely receiving a commission that he will be serving this particular foreign government or the invader for the particular matter, absent any showing of actual assembly of men, that would not make him liable for treason. Now take note that the act of the accused to be liable for treason by levying war, his act must be done by force. So that actually characterize levying war against the government. Another example is that if you enlist to the service of the government of that invader, foreign country, if the purpose there is for the render of service, there is no actual assembly of men, you did not gather men for the purpose of executing treason, then still that would not be considered as levying war against the government. The second way or mode of committing treason is adhering to the enemies, giving them aid or comfort. When we say adherence to the enemies, it presupposes your intent to betray. An aid or comfort means an act which strengthens or tends to strengthen the enemy in the conduct of war against the traitor's country, and an act which weakens or tends to weaken the power of the traitor's country or resist or to attack the enemy. In other words, the second way of committing treason You have their adherence. In other words, you really have that intent to betray your country. And that intent, considering that it is still all in your mind, it is manifest by the overt act that you are going to do. And what is that overt act? Either giving of aid or giving of comfort. That giving of aid or comfort may strengthen the enemy, or it may weaken or just tend to weaken the power of your own country. Either way, that would constitute treason. Now, to illustrate this one, it could be that you might be rendering service, because that service could either be helping the enemy, thereby it could be strengthening their strength or weakening the strength of your own country. But then if you don't have their intent to betray, meaning to say only giving aid or comfort but there no intent to betray, or the other way around, you have their intent to betray but it is not coupled with aid or comfort, can you be made liable for treason? The answer is no. In other words, it must go together, the intent to betray plus giving aid or comfort. Example, you are a doctor and you are commissioned or invited by the enemy country to render medical attention to their citizens or to their soldiers who got injured between the war between that country and the Philippines. Now, if you are there to render service to humanity, your act is giving aid or comfort to the enemy, but you cannot be made liable for treason because the element of intent to betray is absent. But if you are there rendering service knowing that they are enemies, with that contention that this will strengthen their strength against your own country, despite such knowledge of intent to betray, and you are not just there, you are actually rendering them as enemies, then intent to betray is present. Of course, aid or comfort is likewise present. Then that is the time that you can be made liable for treason. Adherence plus giving of aid or comfort, treason. If only intent to betray, no overt act, it is not treason. There was overt act of giving aid or comfort, but no intent to betray or adherence to the enemy, that is not treason. So we have here actually some specific acts of aid or comfort that constitutes treason. So mostly of these cases were handed out during the Japanese occupation. So serving as informer and active member of the Japanese military police, arresting guerrilla suspects, including acting as finger woman or taking active part in killing of civilians at the time of the Japanese occupation. Now take note, we've mentioned here guerrilla hideout, guerrilla suspects. Why? Who are these guerrilla? These are actually our fellow men, fellow Filipinos who were fighting underground against the Japanese because of their abuses. So, if you are there helping the Japanese to arrest or to kill this guerrilla, then you are liable for treason. How about this Makapili? This is actually opposite, or the enemy of the guerrillas. Makapili are actually a group of Filipinos whose heart and loyalty belongs to the Japanese. So being a Makapili member alone makes you liable for treason. Now, let's go a little farther on the ways of proving treason, because what we are discussing is the ways of committing treason. Now here, proving treason. Now you have there the two witness rule. The law says that as far as giving aid or comfort, so that is the overt act. The giving aid or comfort in the second mode of committing treason, the law says that you need the testimony of two witnesses to prove the overt act of giving aid or comfort as far as the accused is concerned. Now, to cite as an example, a witness testified that he saw you um, dragging, or a Japanese was dragging A, and you are there with the Japanese, and in fact, uh, you laugh with them at the time that you are dragging your fellow Filipino. And another witness testified that he heard a shot, and then thereafter he saw you with the Japanese, and your fellow Filipino was found dead right after he heard that gunshot burst of fire. Now take note that the two witnesses did not testify on same detail, but it talks about the same overt act of killing that particular Filipino. Hence, you can be made liable for treason because it complies on the two witness rule. Is it required that adherence to the enemy be testified also by the two witnesses you presented? No, it is not required. Okay, so the two witness rule applies only to the testimony proving the overt act against the accused. Adherence can be testified by one witness. Next, we have their Article 115, which talks about conspiracy and proposal to commit treason. The penalty is prison mayor and a fine not exceeding 2 million, and by prison correctional and a fine not exceeding 1 million. So you have there actually two felonies defined and described in Article 115, conspiracy to commit treason, proposal to commit treason. Now, this is an exception to Article 8 of the Revised Penal Code, which says that mere conspiracy is not punishable. Take note, conspiracy, it's still in the mind. It could be still on the planning stage. There is still no overt act over the particular felony you are agreeing to commit. But this is an exception. So we have conspiracy to commit treason when, in time of war, two or more persons come to an agreement to levy war against the government or to adhere to the enemies and to give them aid or comfort and decide to commit it. Now, take note that the agreement there must be an agreement to levy war against the government or adhere to the enemies. And do not forget that they must decide to commit it. In other words, they are already decided to commit a crime. It is not just a mere thought or thinking of committing it, but they are really decided already. It passes already the subjective phase of your mind. Now, in proposal to commit treason is committed when in time of war, a person who has decided to levy war or to adhere to the enemies to give them aid or comfort proposes its execution to some other person or persons. Now, take note that in proposal to commit treason, the offender here is not just ranting against the government, but or planning anything against the government, but that person must be decided already for the commission of the crime. Now, take note that in conspiracy to commit treason and proposal to commit treason, actual treason is not yet committed. Because if treason is actually committed, no more 115, but the crime is plain and simple treason under 114. So what happened to your conspiracy or proposal under 115? It would be absorbed in 114 as an element, inherent element of treason. 116, you have there misprision of treason. Every person owing allegiance to the government of the Philippine Islands without being a foreigner and having knowledge of any conspiracy against them conceals or does not disclose and make known the same as soon as possible to the governor or fiscal of the province or mayor or fiscal of the city in which he resides, as the case may be, and he shall be punished as an accessory to the crime of treason. Now, what you will remember here in Article 116 is that this is the only felony in Title 1 that can be committed only by Filipinos. Again, this is the only felony in Title 1 that can be committed by Filipinos. And what is the overt act punishable under 116? You have here, having knowledge of any conspiracy against them. What is the offender's knowledge all about? Conspiracy against them. The conspiracy we are referring to here is conspiracy to commit treason. And that accused is liable when, despite such knowledge of conspiracy to commit treason, he conceals, he does not disclose, or he did not make known such conspiracy to commit treason. Okay? Meaning to say, he is a witness to this group of people agreeing to commit treason. He has personal knowledge of the fact that this group of persons have agreed and decided to commit treason. So, the act there of those persons is still conspiracy to commit treason because actual treason did not yet actually took place. So, it is your obligation to disclose said information. It is your obligation to, to not conceal this information, meaning to say you have to make known or to report the same to the governor or fiscal in the province or governor or the fiscal in the city where you reside. And because you failed to do so, you are liable under 116. Now you might be asking, what if what you failed to disclose is the fact that Juan de la Cruz actually helped the Japanese in committing uh, felonies against your fellow Filipinos. You failed to disclose that Juan de la Cruz was one of the or was with the Japanese when they raided the 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 municipal building and took over the municipal building. Now, take note that treason is already committed and your knowledge is about Juan de la Cruz's participation on the treason he committed with the Japanese. Can he be liable under 116? The answer is no. Why? Because treason is already committed and concealing or being silent that this person commits treason is not actually the crime or the felony referred to in 116 because what is being punished here is your failure to disclose knowledge of any conspiracy. See? Mere conspiracy. But what you are concealing is actual conspiracy, actual treason committed by Juan de la Cruz. So, misprision of treason is inapplicable. Juan de la Cruz cannot be you can no longer be made liable for misprision of treason for your failure to disclose the act of Juan de la Cruz committing actual treason. Another thing that you have to remember in 116 is that the offender here in misprision of treason is punished as an accessory to the crime of treason. So in other words, his penalty is 2 degrees lower than that of treason, but he will be charged as a principal under 116 for misprision of treason. To reiterate, he will be punished as an accessory, but he will be charged as principal under Article 116. Okay, so all the elements must be present. Do not forget, first element, the offender is a Filipino citizen. He has knowledge of any conspiracy against the government. He conceals or does not disclose and make known the same as soon as possible to the governor or fiscal of the province or mayor or fiscal of the city which he resides. So I have here a summary on what we have discussed. So can be committed by Filipinos only. The conspiracy is one to commit treason, does not apply when the crime of treason is already committed. The offender is punished as an accessory, but offender is charged as principal. So the exception provided under Article 20 of the RPC does not apply even if the accused here may be the son or the father of the accused. Espionage. What is espionage? The penalty of prison correctional shall be inflicted upon any person who, without authority therefore, enters a warship, fort, or naval or military establishment or reservation to obtain any information, plans, photographs, or other data of a confidential nature relative to the defense of the Philippine archipelago. Now, as far as the first act constituting treason, you have there entrance without authority. Okay? Entrance without authority. Where did you commit this crime, or where will this crime be committed? When you entered a warship, fort, or naval or military establishment or reservation. What is the purpose of that entrance? To obtain any information, plans, photographs, or other data of a confidential nature relative to the defense of the Philippine archipelago. In other words, you enter these places mentioned, the entrance there is without authority, your purpose there is to obtain information, they must all be present. Because if you enter on these places mentioned without authority for the purpose of taking a selfie so that you can post it in FB or IG whatsoever, one of the element of obtaining information is absent. So all the requisites under the first act must be present to make you liable for espionage. The second act constituting espionage is one committed by a public officer. The law says that being in possession by reason of the public office he holds of the articles, data, or information referred to in the preceding paragraph discloses their contents to a representative of a foreign nation. And if you are there a public officer committing espionage under the second act, the penalty next higher in degree shall be imposed upon you. Now, in the second act of espionage, the information that you discloses to a representative of foreign nation is with respect to articles or data referred to in the first paragraph. And what is that first paragraph? It talks about information, data, or any plan relative to the defense of the country. So if you discloses this information, then you are liable for espionage. So espionage is defined as the offense of gathering, transmitting, or losing information respecting the national defense with the intent or reason to believe that the information is to be used to the injury of the Republic of the Philippines or to the advantage of any foreign nation. Now, by the way, with respect to the first act, you have their entrance without authority in any warship, naval, or fort to obtain information. Is it necessary that you actually able to obtain information? No, it is not material. It is sufficient that you entered without authority on those places in order to obtain information relative to the defense of the Philippines. So you have there the elements. Again, all the elements must be present to make one liable. So just go over them as we already have discussed them as we have read the provision of the law. Now you also have there Commonwealth Act 616. In Commonwealth Act 616, it talks also about espionage. While in the revised penal code, it gives you only two acts constituting espionage. In Commonwealth Act 616, there are actually many acts on which one can be made liable for espionage. So espionage is not a crime conditioned by the citizenship of the offender. In other words, it can be committed by a Filipino and an alien, which is the same as that of treason. To distinguish espionage also from treason, espionage can be committed both in time of peace and in time of war and in many ways. But treason is committed only in time of war and is committed only in two ways. Article 118, inciting to war or giving motives for reprisals. The penalty of reclusion temporal shall be imposed upon any public officer or employee, and that of prison mayor upon any private individual who, by unlawful or unauthorized acts, provokes or gives occasion for a war involving or liable to involve the Philippine Islands or exposes Filipino citizens to reprisals on their persons or property. In other words, the person that can be made liable here could either be public officer or employee, and in fact the penalty is higher as compared to if committed by a private individual. And what is the overt act here of the offender? He performs unauthorized or unlawful acts, and that act of the accused provokes or gives occasion for war involving or liable to involve the Philippines or exposes Filipino citizens to reprisals on their persons or property. Now, take note that in 118, intention of the offender is immaterial. It is committed in time of peace, and penalty is higher when the offender is a public officer or employee. Again, what are the elements of this felony? The offender performs unlawful or unauthorized acts, and such act provoke or give occasion of a war involving or liable to involve the Philippines or to expose your fellow Filipino citizens to reprisals on their either person or property because of your unauthorized and unlawful acts. Violation of neutrality, Article 119. The penalty of prison correctional shall be inflicted upon anyone who, on the occasion of a war in which the government is not involved, violates any regulation issued by competent authority for the purpose of enforcing neutrality. Now, if we go by the definition of violation of neutrality under 119, these are the elements of the felony. That there is war in which the Philippines is not involved. Okay? The Philippines is not involved in a war. So, the Philippines issued a regulation for the purpose of enforcing neutrality, and that the offender violates such regulation. Neutrality is defined as when a nation or power which takes no part in a contest or arms of going on between others is referred to as neutral. Now, what constitutes the violation or what constitutes violation under this article is the fact that you violate the regulation. If there is no regulation issued by competent authority to enforce neutrality over a war in which the Philippines is not involved, then there is no violation of neutrality because of the absence of the issuance of that regulation. Correspondence to hostile country. Any person who in time of war shall have correspondence with an enemy country or territory occupied by any troops shall be punished. Prison correctional if the correspondence has been prohibited by government. Prison mayor if the correspondence be carried on in ciphers or conventional signs. By reclusion temporal, if notice or information be given thereby, which might be useful to the enemy. If the offender intended to aid the enemy by giving such notice or information, he shall suffer the penalty of reclusion temporal to death. Now, take note that the overt act punished here in Article 120 is correspondence, sending letters to the enemy countries. For example, Philippines is at war with Indonesia. You cannot send any correspondence to Indonesia. What do we mean by territory occupied by any troops? Let us say that the Philippines is at war with Indonesia and Indonesia invaded or occupied Vietnam. So if you also send a letter to Vietnam, which is a territory occupied by the Indonesians to which the Philippines is at war, that would also constitute as a violation under Article 20. But the question would be, when shall it be a violation? Now, under paragraph 1, the law says that correspondence has been prohibited by the government. In other words, there must be that issuance or order by the Philippines prohibiting the sending of correspondence, sending of letters. However, in paragraph 2 and 3, if your correspondence or letter be carried on in ciphers or conventional sign, even if there is no prohibition by the government, that would still be a violation under correspondence with hostile country. Presume, it is presumed that you have there the tendency of aiding the enemy because your correspondence was not done the usual way but through ciphers. Okay? It could be code or any kind of writing So what's your purpose? So you are punished under correspondence with hostile country. Now, if under third paragraph, if you notice, the penalty is reclusion temporal to death, which is the same as that of treason. Why? Let's examine. If notice or information be given thereby which might be useful to the enemy, the offender intended to aid the enemy by giving such information or notice, that is actually treasonous already, because your overt act there, since you intended to aid the enemy, that constitutes treason by adhering to the enemy, giving them aid or comfort. That's why the penalty there is the same as that of treason. So here, elements, the Philippines is involved in a war, and the offender makes correspondence with an enemy country or territory occupied by any enemy troops, and the correspondence is either prohibited by the government, carried on in ciphers or conventional signs, containing notice or information which might be useful to the enemy. So correspondence, that is, we're referring to communication by means of letters. So even if correspondence contains innocent matters, but considering that the same is prohibited by the government, that would still constitute a violation of this act if you send correspondence to the enemy country or the territory occupied by the enemy troops. Okay, again, in paragraph B and C, there is no need of regulation or issuance prohibiting the correspondence. And the crime is committed. Circumstances qualifying the offense, it must concur together. The information might be useful to the enemy, that the offender intended to aid the enemy. So in other words, there is only intention to aid the enemy. It is not required that it actually give aid to the enemy. Okay? So the penalty is the same as that of treason. Flight to enemy country. The penalty of aristo mayor shall be inflicted upon any person who, owing allegiance to the government, attempts to flee or go to an enemy country when prohibited by competent authority. So there are actually two overt acts constituting a violation under Article 121. The mere attempt to flee is sufficient to make you liable under 121, or you went to an enemy country when prohibited by competent authority. Who can be made liable? Filipinos and resident aliens, because the law says any person owing allegiance to the government. Again, mere attempt to flee or go to the enemy country consummates the crime. Piracy. So 122, piracy in general and mutiny on the high seas. The penalty of reclusion perpetua shall be inflicted upon any person who, on the high seas or Philippine waters, shall attack or seize a vessel, or not being a member of its complement nor a passenger, shall seize the whole or part of the cargo of said vessel, its equipment, or personal belongings of its complement or passengers. The same penalty shall be inflicted in case of mutiny on the high seas or in Philippine waters. Now, there are actually two ways or modes of committing piracy: attacking or seizing a vessel on the high seas or in Philippine waters. What is Philippine waters? So you go back with the definition of our archipelago in Article 1 of the Constitution. So you have there all waters of the Philippines. And then high seas, that is outside the territorial jurisdiction of the Philippines. So if you attack a vessel or you seize a vessel, that is piracy. Now, second way of committing by seizing in the vessel while on the high seas or in Philippine waters the whole or part of its cargo. Now, the first part, attacking or seizing the vessel itself. The second mode is seizing the vessel while on the high seas or in Philippine waters the whole or part of its cargo, equipment or personal belongings of its complement or passengers. So in the second act, what you seize here is the cargo of the vessel, equipment of the vessel, or the personal belongings of the complement or passengers while boarding the vessel. Elements that the vessel is on the high seas or in Philippine waters. The offenders are not members of its complement or passenger of the vessel. That the offenders attack, seize that vessel, or seize the whole or part of the cargo of said vessel, equipment, personal belongings of its complement or passengers. Now you might be asking, under what circumstance that the Philippines is enforcing its law on high seas when we have there the territoriality characteristics of our criminal law. Now, take note that piracy is a crime against the law of nations. It knows no boundaries. It has no boundary limits. It has no territorial jurisdiction. So, the Philippines can acquire jurisdiction over the crime of piracy. So what is piracy? Again, it is the robbery or forcible depredation on the high seas without lawful authority and done with animo furandi. So you have their animo furandi, intent to, what's animo furandi? Intent to steal, intent to benefit, intent to gain. And then mutiny is the unlawful resistance to a superior officer or the raising of commotions and disturbances on board a ship against the authority of its commander. So in other words, the mutiny there is actually the resistance as far as the accused is concerned over the order or authority of the, let's say, captain of the vessel or the ship. Animo furandi, intent to steal. Okay. So what's the difference? Are they the same? So to distinguish the two, considering that there are actually two felonies described in the law. Piracy is the crime committed if the persons who attack or seize its vessel or cargo are strangers to said vessel, and there is intent to gain on the part of the offenders. Whereas mutiny, the offenders here are members of the crew or the passengers. They don't have intent to gain, but what they have is intent to ignore the ship's officer, or they may be prompted by the desire to commit plunder as far as the ship's officer is concerned. And piracy and mutiny may be regarded as terrorism. So under RA 9372 or the Human Security Act of 2007, the act of piracy or mutiny may constitute as terrorism if the act of the accused in committing piracy or mutiny sows and creates a condition of widespread and extraordinary panic and fear among the populace in order to coerce the government to give in to their unlawful demand shall be guilty of the crime of terrorism, and the penalty shall be 40 years of imprisonment without the benefit of parole. So if you notice here, the crime of terrorism highest is the crime with the highest penalty so far in the Philippines, because if you say other crimes carrying with it the penalty of reclusion perpetua, the duration of reclusion perpetua is 20 years and 1 day to 40 years, and he may be released on the 30th year. There is a possibility, but in terrorism, it is 40 years imprisonment. So that is the highest, the penalty, the crime with the highest penalty so far. When is piracy qualified? The penalty is reclusion perpetua to death, and the same shall be imposed whenever they have seized a vessel by boarding or firing upon the same. Okay, so if you have their fire seizing the vessel by boarding or firing the same, qualified piracy. Or whenever the pirates have abandoned their victims without means of saving themselves, and whenever the crime is accompanied by murder, homicide, physical injuries, or rape. Now take note of the accompanying crimes when piracy is committed. If homicide is committed in the course of the piracy or mutiny, you do not say that the crime committed is qualified piracy through homicide or with homicide, but plain and simple qualified piracy. It is an inherent element of qualified piracy. Now take note that in paragraph 2 it mentions pirates. Does it mean to say that it does not include mutineers? Now if you are going to examine closely, pirate should have been specifically stated under the first paragraph. Why? Because in no way that a member or a passenger will board the vessel when they committed the crime, because they are already there inside the vessel. So per comment of the author, these pirates here should include mutiny, because if you take a look at the first paragraph, it says here preceding article, and the preceding article talks about piracy and mutiny. Okay, so since you are talking about piracy, so if the act of the accused was done in an aircraft, it's not a vessel, so the law governs such act would be RA 6235. So it shall be unlawful for any person to compel a change in the course or destination of an aircraft of Philippine registry, or to seize or usurp the control thereof while it is in flight. An aircraft is in flight from the moment all its external doors are closed following embarkation until any of such doors is open for disembarkation. Now, in the first paragraph, what you have to remember is that you have their aircraft of Philippine registry. Question: what determines whether the aircraft is of Philippine registry or of foreign registry? Would it be the nationality of the owner of the aircraft? The answer is no. The aircraft is of Philippine registry if the same is registered under Philippine laws, regardless of the nationality of the owner. Now, as in the bar, when is an aircraft deemed in flight? So an aircraft is in flight from the moment all its external doors are closed. So I think all of you have boarded an aircraft already. So the moment that you entered the aircraft, that is the external door. When you get in farther, maybe if you are there in the business class, so there is that another door separating it from the economy. So the door that you are to take into consideration when the aircraft started to be considered to be in flight, you have there the moment the external doors are closed. Even if it has not taken off yet, the aircraft is considered to be in flight already. Until when? Until any of such doors is opened for disembarkation. Meaning to say, after it has taken off, it landed, it is already there in the runway and it is taxiing to the place where the passengers would be allowed to unload. The aircraft there is still considered to be in flight until such time that that door, the external door, is open for disembarkation. Next paragraph. It shall likewise be unlawful for any person to compel an aircraft of foreign registry to land in the Philippine territory or to seize or usurp the control thereof while it is within the said territory. Now, the next paragraph talks about aircraft of foreign registry. The overt act of the accused here committing the crime is when he seizes or usurp the control. It is required that the aircraft of foreign registry be in flight. It is not. It is not required. It is sufficient that foreign the aircraft of foreign registry is in the Philippines. It shall be unlawful for any person to carry, natural or juridical, to ship, load, or carry in any passenger aircraft operating as a public utility within the Philippines any explosive, flammable, corrosive, or poisonous substances or material. That's why when you board an aircraft, you have to prohibit bringing all these flammable or explosives and even corrosive substances uh, that is actually specifically provided under RA 6235. Okay, so that ends Title 1 plus the special laws that we have mentioned. And I hope you have learned something out of this recording. Thank you.